You're looking at a painting by a not so famous Italian artist. It's usually known as the forest fire. Oddly enough, seeing it in person isn't easy. These days, it hangs in an archaeological museum in Oxford, which almost makes you wonder if someone is trying to keep it out of sight. At first, the scene seems straightforward enough: a forest fire, terrified animals running for their lives, and the hunter taking advantage of the chaos. But then your eye drifts to the left. There you find a group of bizarre creatures, part goat, part pig, but with unmistakably human faces. So, what on earth are they doing there? If you first thought is some kind of secret genetic experiment, I can't really blame you, but the real answer is much simpler and in its own way, even more unsettling. Today we are going to meet the artist behind this painting. He isn't very well known, but he was one of the most original minds of the Renaissance. And along the way, we'll end up talking a little bit about philosophy and about why, for most, let's say, ordinary people, it may actually be wiser to stay away from it. By the way, my name is Alexey Pashkov. I am an art historian and I try to help people experience art more deeply, to notice its hidden meanings, its strange perspectives, and the quiet logic that holds it all together. So, our story begins with Piero di Cosimo. He lived at the end of the 15th century and belonged to the same world as Leonardo da Vinci, and yet, in many ways, he feels like Leonardo's complete opposite. Piero is one of those rare Renaissance artists whose personality we can almost see through the centuries. Of course, we have Giorgio Vasari to thank for that. Vasari was the author of the famous collection of Renaissance artists' biographies. It was through his book that later generations first encountered the lives of Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, and many other great masters. But Vasari rarely gives us what we would call a psychologically convincing portrait. Usually, he lists an artist's works, throws a few entertaining stories, a few details, and moves on. As a result, the great masters often end up reduced to a handful of cliches. Raphael is the cheerful extrovert, Michelangelo the brooding lunar, Leonardo the calm and all knowing genius. Useful labels, perhaps, but still very broad ones. With Piero di Cosimo, though, Vasari becomes unusually specific. The artist almost seems to step out of the pages and into the room. To begin with, Piero was an eccentric. He was quiet, introverted, and completely absorbed in his own imagination. Vasari says, "This youth, Piero di Cosimo, possessed by nature a spirit lofty yet distracted. At times he became so absorbed in his work that even if he was speaking with someone, at the end everything had to be told to him again, for his thoughts had already been carried away by some new fantasy, and his only pleasure was to wander alone, dreamingly, building castles in the air." But there was another side to his personality that matters even more for understanding his art: an unusual love of nature and animals. Some people never feel entirely comfortable around other people, you know? They feel more at ease in the natural world instead. Piero seems to have been one of them. His biographer describes a man who lived almost like a hermit. He hated having his rooms swept. He ate only when hunger became impossible to ignore. He refused to prune trees, let vines grow wherever they pleased, and generally preferred everything in its wild, natural state. Vasari says that Piero loved watching animals, plants, and anything that nature happened to produce strangely and by chance. He found so much pleasure in those odd little accidents that he would come back to them again and again, so often, in fact, that he eventually would wore out everyone around him. You can see that fascination all over his paintings. At the time, still life and landscape had not yet become independent genres, and paintings devoted entirely to animals were almost unheard of. But Piero comes surprisingly close. He takes mythological stories and fills them with birds, beasts, and plants until the painting begins to feel less like a myth and more like a study of the living world itself. Now, there is one painting that matters especially for our story. One of Piero's most famous works is usually called Cephalus and Procris. Even the title is debated, and the myth itself is a dark one. Procris suspects her husband, Cephalus, of having an affair with the goddess Aurora. She secretly follows him on a hunt. He hears a sound in the bushes, throws his spear, which never misses, and accidentally kills his own wife. The strange thing is that in Piero's version, the figure kneeling over the body is a goat-legged satyr, which hardly looks like Cephalus, who was a human, but the traditional title has stuck. And notice what Piero chooses to emphasize. Procris herself is painted with extraordinary delicacy, almost in a way that feels ahead of its time, but emotionally she is not really the center of the picture. The real focus is the living world around her, the dogs, the heron, the pelican floating on the water, and especially one dog standing beside the body, its head lowered and its tail tucked between its legs. You understand its grief immediately. Piero was remarkably good at painting animal emotions, and I think that is exactly why he chose a satire. The satire is half animal, and even his mourning feels animal rather than human. You do not read despair in his face. The emotion is carried by the body itself, the alert ears, the tense posture, the careful hands touching the skin, as if trying to answer a simple question: is she still warm? Is her heart still beating? He seems to listen and sniff the air the way an animal would, scenting that faint, chilling smell of death beginning to spread. In other words, the emotion here is not facial, it's physical. And once you notice that, another of Piero's paintings suddenly makes much more sense. Oh, but before we move on to the next painting, could I ask you to subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the story, of course? It's really just nice to know that somewhere out there are people who find art as fascinating as I do. So, thank you in advance. Okay, back to the forest fire. The most convincing thing in the whole painting is the terror of the animals. Just look at the bull, its tongue hanging out, its mouth open in panic, rendered with an almost painful sense of reality. And yet the question remains, why did Piero give some of those creatures human faces? To answer that question, we need to zoom out a little. Piero painted a whole series of works that seem to imagine the earliest stages of human history, life before what we call civilization, before people settled into cities and so on. The forest fire was most likely part of that series. The idea itself was not new. Ancient writers already imagined humanity passing through different stages, first living in caves and wearing animal skins, then gradually discovering tools, building shelters, and learning to work with the metal. Piero seems to paint exactly that progression. One scene shows primitive hunting, with people using clubs and even their bare hands. Another looks almost like the birth of technology itself: rough wooden huts, a blacksmith working at a simple forge. So, where did he get the idea? The answer may lie in one ancient text, where fire plays a crucial role: Lucretius's On the Nature of Things. And to understand that, we need to make a brief detour into philosophy. In the first century BC, there lived a Greek philosopher named Epicurus. Today, the word Epicurean usually makes people think of luxury, indulgence, and chasing pleasure, but that is really a misunderstanding. a simplified, almost vulgar version of what he actually taught. I say actually with some caution because Epicurus' own writings have almost entirely disappeared. The Christian church was not especially fond of his ideas. You see, Epicurus was a materialist. He rejected the idea of an immortal soul. He imagined the universe as a vast collection of tiny atoms moving through empty space, colliding, joining together, separating again. Heavy things sank, lighter things rose, and over immense stretches of time, the world gradually took shape. In some ways, it sounds surprisingly modern, at least in spirit, even if the science itself belonged to an antiquity. And if there is no immortal soul, then there are no gods directing the human affairs. And if there are no gods, then there is no cosmic purpose and no universal moral law handed down from above. Under those conditions, the rational goal of life becomes pleasure, because this one life is all you have. But not the kind of pleasure people usually imagine. You see, Epicurus understood perfectly well that physical excess quickly turns into suffering. His ideal life was built around quieter, more lasting pleasures, good conversations, books, poetry, friendship. He lived in a small garden with a circle of close companions, stayed away from politics, and believed that a calm, peaceful existence was the highest form of happiness. Almost all of Epicurus' own works have been lost, like I said, but one great retelling survived: the Latin poem on the nature of things, written by Lucretius or Lucretius. The Romans encountered Greek philosophy through a language barrier. Latin simply did not have many of the philosophical terms that Greek thinkers used, so writers like Lucretius had to do more than translate words. They had to translate entire system of thought into a new language. So he chose to do it in the form of a long philosophical poem. And in that poem, he describes humanity beginning in a primitive stage and slowly discovering the arts of civilization: houses, tools, metalworking, and the other skills that gradually transformed the world. He also explains how people first encountered fire. According to Lucretius, it came from lightning, but also from trees rubbing together during violent winds, branches grinding against one another until they burst into flame. And on Piero's painting, that is exactly where the fire begins, deep inside the forest. It is almost as though Lucretius' poem has been turned into an image. So it seems very likely that Piero knew Lucretius' ideas, either directly or through one of the many summaries circulating at the time. After all, the poem had been rediscovered in 1437 by Poggio Bracciolini, and by Piero's lifetime it was already being copied and printed. And now, finally, we can return to those strange human-headed beasts. As it turns out, Lucretius talks about them too. He says that in the earliest days of the world, the earth produced all kinds of monstrous forms: beings that were neither male nor female, creatures without legs or arms, others that were blind or mute, their limbs fused together so that they could not move and they could not feed themselves, neither escape danger nor find a mate. Nature itself, he says, prevented those creatures from developing any further. They could never reach what he calls the dawn of life. They just naturally died out. And that, I think, is exactly what Piero is showing us. The painting captures an ancient age when those failed experiments of nature still wandered on Earth, those strange human-faced beasts already on their way to extinction. This interpretation helps explain two things. First, the painting has nothing to do with the secret genetic experiments or hidden esoteric symbolism. Its strangeness comes from philosophy. Piero seems to be simply illustrating the poem of Lucretius. But there is a second point, and I think it is more important one. It may also explain the deep melancholy that runs through so much of Piero's work. Epicurean materialism can free you from your fear of death, but it may replace that fear with something else. Epicurus actually believed he was doing humanity a great service. If there is no immortal soul and no afterlife, then death is nothing more than a dreamless sleep. And if that is true, then what is there to fear? A famous saying is attributed to him: "When I exist, death is not. When death exists, I am not." In other words, I never actually encounter my own death. Death cannot be a bad experience for me because once it arrives, there is no me left to experience anything at all. It is a remarkably elegant argument, and yet I think it leaves behind a different kind of wound, the sorrow that comes from meaningless. You see, for a religious person, the world has a structure. Even suffering can be understood as part of a larger story, a trial, an act of providence, justice postponed, preparation for another life. From a materialistic point of view, nature and every living creature share one universal condition: the capacity to suffer. But that suffering serves no purpose, and that is the real tragedy. Look again at Pietro's painting. Look at the terrified bull. Look at the mother bear trying to lead her cubs away from the fire. You can always feel the deep empathy that Piero had to the suffering animals, and how clearly he sensed its complete futility. Seen from that perspective, melancholy almost feels like the rational response. And I think that may be the key to understanding Piero di Cosimo's dark and lonely temperament. It was a profoundly materialist way of seeing the world. Now you realize what I mean by saying that you should probably stay away from philosophy. But what you should not stay away from, though, is this channel. If you like today's little lecture, please hit subscribe so that you wouldn't miss the next one. I bring you a new fascinating story about little known masterpieces every week. Thank you, and see you in the next one.